Hello everyone, this is Ophelia Marauder. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be talking about shell mechanics. This is a recording of a seminar that I gave in a Discord server in front of a whole group of people about shell mechanics and their intricacies, differences between the HE, differences between AP, differences between the different attributes and backend attributes of shell mechanics and everything that they entail. This was a pretty uh, lengthy presentation that I put together, and you'll hear people asking questions throughout it. This is meant to be a guide that no matter who you are, you can learn off of it and gain more information about shell mechanics, including any hidden attributes or information that's in them. But before we get into this, I want to thank all of the groups that I got information from. I'd like to thank Little White Mouse for correspondence that I had with her over the forums that allowed me to gain the information and clarify some information about some of the shell mechanics and some of the back end stuff. She was very helpful in clarifying some of these little bits of information. I'd like to thank Game Model 3D and the WoW Scammer blog for information on hidden statistics and the values, and just being able to use this to compare some values and help strengthen my information that I wrote. I'd like to thank user Totero on Reddit for his write-ups on how splash damage works and how for both ships and submarines. Shout out to Suboctavian's write-up that he made a long time ago about how aiming and dispersion works. And a shout out to the Wargaming How It Works series of videos and the WoW's Wiki for their informations, where I took some of the charts from and took some of the graphics from those different styles of presentation, and I appreciate that those were available for me to use. But first here, a little bit of a disclaimer. The information in the slideshow is all done from the standpoint of a technical analysis and explanation. There may be examples in here that show something that is suboptimal from a competitive point of view. The presentation does not show these things because it is touting they have merit. It's merely stating fact, irrespective of anyone's views on the subject. Everything here is put on the table in the equal light of that these are the facts, without any editorialization, personal conjecture, or personal bias involved from either the author, third-party sources, or other attributable groups. It is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The author encourages everyone who uses this reference to do their own research and draw their own conclusions about anything that relates to personal interpretation, personal strategy, or combat-worthy concepts. This guide is not designed to serve as a justification for anything from one view or another. I'm driving this point home so that I don't get slammed with nasty comments of opinionated people who are going to just end up, review bombing me or go to the Discord because I mentioned something about some ship having this attribute if you apply XYZ upgrade to it or whatnot. We're not explaining these things because we think they're a good idea. They're simply being used as examples to get you interested to do your own research on shell mechanics and to get involved in the topic yourself and kind of spark that curiosity. So with that out of the way, we're getting right into the presentation, so here we go. So, Part 1, Weapons Platform. As we can see, a little example here from left to right are the turrets of Napoli, Clemson, and Gangut. They all look different. I think Napoli's looks pretty beautiful. Anyway, so, turrets. First thing before you even fire your guns. Elevation and depression. Angles of the guns articulate up and down in the turret. These are set by Wargaming in relation to the range you aim at, and they're hard-coded in. The angle of the gun dictates the flight path of the shell and if it can clear certain targets or not. Not every gun can depress its turrets, which means it can lower it below the resting plane. That's due to how some turrets are constructed. And this will come up a couple more times, but just to make it clear, there's actually a back-end statistic of your gun elevation and depression time. That is actually a value set by Wargaming as to what you have. So if you've ever had your guns lag when going up and down and like there's a destroyer coming close to you and you have to switch and like your guns are rotated but you're wondering why you can't fire, it's because your guns don't depress fast enough. If you've ever noticed that, especially in Battleship, I think North Carolina is where I've ever seen it like really prevalent. But elevation and depression is very much a real thing in the game. Next is firing angles. These are the angles where your guns can rotate about the ship. These angles dictate how many guns you can have on a target at a point in relation to where your hull is. And your blind spot. This is a part of the ship where your guns cannot fire. Every ship has one of these. Some of them are super, super small and really don't matter, and some of them are big. For example, pictured here, Issei has the entire flight deck Blocking her back guns. If a destroyer comes behind you, which when this ship first came out, I saw people who would meme Iseis by running their destroyer just behind them, and they can't get shot at by the Issei, and they'll just shadow them the entire time. So just wanted to say that don't have to be super worried about it, but keep an eye out on it. There's a lot that you have to be worried about in the game when it comes to analyzing and break down each ship specifically. Next, range. This is how far your guns can fire. Shots are closer are more accurate, and shots farther away are less accurate. Pretty standard. XYZ plotting. This is where you aim your guns. X and Y are controlled by your mouse moving up and down, left and right, and the zoom, the Z-axis, is controlled by your shift, scrolling, and checking against your minimap. Some players I've heard refer to this as windage when they're just making an offhand comment on Reddit or the forums. It's not proper ballistics windage, but if you hear someone using this term, they're talking about plotting, but they really don't know what they're talking about. Target lock on. When you lock on with target, a vertical plane is drawn through your ship from the bow to the stern. This scales where you aim, so you have a better Z-axis control over your plotting. If you aim at one ship while locked onto another, your shells will fire in relation to the locked on target. And most of the time, you're going to miss. It's just what's going to end up happening because you're not scaling in your aim in relation to the target you want to hit. You're scaling it to the one you're locked on. This can be controlled by pressing X in order to manually lock or unlock off of a target. And this is one of the charts here. This is Octavian's famous USS Cactus drawing, showing the aiming plane where the ellipse is drawn. So as you can see, the ellipse is drawn from bow to stern on the Cactus, and the ellipsoid then basically intersects this vertical plane, and that's where all your shells are going to be shot in relation to it. Like in real life, if you move your guns on that aren't locked onto a target, you'll make very massive changes in where shells will aim, even by moving a fraction of a degree. This plane rationalizes it and makes it easier for you to aim. Shell spawn. So, thanks to many of the glitches Wargaming has put over the years into the game in relation to all of the wonderful mechanic bugs that they've had, most notably the last one with Nuevo de Julio, where the guns would literally rotate independent of the turrets. So the guns would just be rotating about the turret, and the turret would just be forward. So the guns are like floating in space. Based on glitches like this, it's been determined that shells spawn at the tip of the barrel in the gun. So right here, that's where they spawn when they're shot. Once the shell model, like the physical 3D asset, leaves the barrel, that's when all of the that's when it basically comes alive, if you will. That's when the shell is able to physically do damage to a ship. Anything else after this is also kind of speculation, but like people have seen it glitch where that's where it spawns, so it's pretty much there. Reload. So after you fire a shell, your guns will load a new shell, right? If your guns are damaged mid-reload, the reload starts over once the gun is repaired. If the gun is reloaded when disabled, the gun can fire again as soon as the gun is repaired. So if you don't have a shell ready to go, you're going to have to wait the entire duration, which sucks, and it kind of impacts your ability to do damage. So, part 2. A shell is fired. From left to right here, we have the shells of Ohio, Akazuki, and Daido in action. So, once the shell is fired, a few things are applied. The first thing that applies in the calculations is the dispersion ellipsoid. It's a circular like or oval at the point at which you aim that the shells can possibly land in. Few ships have a near perfect circular ellipsoid, so most of them you see have a pretty elongated circle. It's the ellipsoid is anywhere the shells can land within the circle. The center ellipsoid is calculated based on your range. So the maximum range from the tip of your gun to the center of the ellipsoid, that's just where that ends up, right? So everything else from there is calculated, scales back in. An ellipsoid is formed per turret. If you do not fire on a locked on enemy, the ellipsoid size is going to be double. This is why it's actually kind of impressive when people hit ships in smoke, because the ellipsoid is literally just double. So if you have a Let's say you have a 150 by 100 meter ellipsoid, it's now 300 by 200. So it's absolutely massive, and it's bigger than any ship in the game by dimension, right? So once again, it's pretty impressive when people hit shots and smoke. There are three stances of which the ellipsoid parameter is hit. So there's minimal, which is the closest you can shoot. That is a separate calculation of a super small ellipsoid. That one's really hard to find in the game, and there's really no set parameters as to which that one is. The close one is the ellipsoid you get at 4 kilometers. Your ellipsoid size scales between 4 kilometers and the next stance, which is the maximum, which is the largest you can be. That's where it primarily scales. The ellipsoid from 4 kilometers to the minimal distance you can fire is a separate set of scaling, and it's done this way so that it changes basically how those shells are actually hitting, and it helps make it easier for you to hit at those close ranges, especially when you're doing drive-bys and whatnot. The way that the game scales the information, sometimes you'll actually just straight up miss if it wasn't for this parameter. There's two parameter you'll see, or on or on port or in stat sites, you'll see the maximum unmodified dispersion ellipsoid. That is what it always shows you. It doesn't show you the closer minimal, and closer minimal has to be mathematically calculated backwards, and it's a lot of work. Um, so those are kind of hard to find. Uh, each ellipsoid stance has two parts, which is the horizontal and vertical number, and these can change based on in-game upgrades. We'll talk about a little bit later. So, for example, here on the left, we have each ellipsoid being drawn off of one of the turrets of Fuso here. So as you guys can see, there's a common area, and if all six turrets had one drawn on this example here, there'd be a pretty odd-shaped common area, and that's where the basically all the firepower kind of clusters in. It's not really a mechanic. This is more just kind of a thing that happens. That's really where most of your shots are going to end up aiming. On the right side here, this is a better example of the difference between close and your maximum dispersion ellipsoid. And between the distance of the 100 meters and 272 meters, as you can see, the scaling is different for a reason, right? If it was incremental between the base of your ship into 4 kilometers at being 100, right? Then by this logic, at 12 kilometers, you'd be at 300 meters, which would be much bigger than the ellipsoid at the maximum range, right? So this is why the close to far gets a different scaling parameter and is set mathematically to have a different scaling parameter than you get the same parameter when you're from close to minimal. Because otherwise, you'd have a massive size ellipsoid all the way at the end of your range.
Quick question that applies to this. Due to RNG, can the range change daily, or is it always the same?
So you can if you improve your range, it'll push the ellipsoid back. We're going to talk about it a little bit later, but keep that in mind because you can actually you will rescale your ellipsoid's increment once it gets pushed backwards.
Apology, I meant dispersion.
Oh,
Can that
dispersion.
change daily due to RNG? Or are these circles always exact?
Well, that's what we're going to get into here. The ellipsoid is always the same. So if you add on range mod, for example, it may change the scaling. But the ellipsoid is always the same for your ship at a range. So at 4 kilometers for Fuso in the last example, it is always 100 meters long for your ellipsoid. It's always going to be that way. Wargaming will tell you if it changes the maximum ellipsoid parameters, and then it'll tell you if it scales accordingly. Unless they tell you you're close ellipsoid, it won't let you know. The dispersion is how frequently your shells land in certain areas within the ellipsoid, which is this next part here. They play off of each other. Sigma is the mathematical probability that a shell lands towards the center ellipsoid, and it uses a Gaussian distribution formula. I'm not going to get into Gaussian distribution because I wanted to put bits about that in this presentation. I started reading on Wikipedia, and as friendly as Wikipedia tries to make everything, it hurt my head. But basically, it's a probability of how likely a number comes up given a randomization pattern, and that's what this pattern is. The dispersion is plotted, and the sigma is calculated per gun mount at the time of firing for each turret. On the right hand side here, you can see this is something Sub Octavian actually did using his their developer version of WoW. So they made New Mexico and Fuso both fire 10 shells at the exact same time, and that's Fuso at 9 kilometers and 17, and New Mexico at 9 kilometers and 17. The further you get out, the more your shells arc, and the more of a stable pattern you get when they land within the ellipsoid because of how they travel with their arc. When you're closer, they're a little more spread out because the shells are kind of moving on a more flat plane, and they're more randomized as they strike the water surface. So when you're shooting at a ship that's much closer to you, you'll have this kind of thing occur. But once again, breaking into the sub 4 kilometer dispersion ellipsoid, that's when things flip back on their head and you get even more accurate because the ship's so close to you, it changes the perimeter so it's easier to hit. Um, which is why uh, if you've ever seen a Slava, get really close to another ship at the end of the game with some weird nonsense, you're like, oh, well, Slava can't hit crap at close range, and at 3 kilometers absolutely blows a cruiser away. And you're like, what the hell? It's not supposed to have good dispersion at all. No, it changes, and it's due to this kind of distribution here. Dispersion ellipsoids as well matter a great deal in relation to your sigma. For example, on the 2 sigma column here, you see a much larger dispersion ellipsoid, and the shells aren't really that clustered together. But on the smaller ellipsoid with a 1 sigma parameter, it's significantly more clustered. So the size of your ellipsoid, more often than not, is a bigger impact of your accuracy than your dispersion parameter. Because if your ellipsoid on your ship is bigger, it means that the shells have a greater area to cover, and there's more variable places that the Gaussian distribution can place the shell. If you make that parameter smaller of where it can have basically um, a if true equation to put the shell in an area, then it is more likely to go towards the cluster up and get smaller. So this is why you see destroyers, plink away pretty much where you aim, and white cruisers, if you throw shots out, they'll just go everywhere. So, characteristics of a shell. Pretty standard stuff here. Damage. How much damage a shell can do to an enemy ship, part, or module. Pretty self-explanatory. Caliber. How large the gun is. Pretty self-explanatory. Velocity. How fast the shell is going when fired at the point it leaves the barrel. So to reference back to the point where we talked about where shell spawn is, as soon as the shell model physically leaves the barrel, that's when the maximum velocity of your gun starts. Once you move literally a pixel past where that gun barrel is, the shell immediately begins to slow down. So it stays constant until it physically is out in the world, and then it does whatever. Wait, this is how heavy a shell is, and this plus velocity greatly impact with the next coefficient of air drag. The air drag coefficient is how wind resistant the shell is. So a low drag means your shell doesn't lose a lot of speed. A high drag means it loses a lot of speed. These factors really are hard coded in, and you can't do anything to change it. You can't make your guns shoot faster. You can't make your shells heavier. You can't make your shells less wind resistant. Unless you're switching modules out that are researchable, you can't really change your caliber. I mean, couple examples like Furtalk able to go from 200 to 203, or GK able to do its gun replacement from 406 to 420. But for the most part, like, I can't make my 420 gun bigger. I can't do that. And damage, for the most part, there's some skills that let you increase the damage there, but once again, you're really not able to like crank it up or crank it down. The velocity of the shell doesn't change how much damage you do. It's still the same set per shell. So that's kind of how it works out. They're a little movable, but the differences in these variables mean a lot. And for this, I have a wonderful example between two tier 5 cruisers that some people couldn't care less about, but are a great example of this, and that is Murmansk and Omaha. So these look pretty much the same, right? But there's a massive difference in their penetration capacity despite their flight time. So Murmansk has 0.001 less drag coefficient than Omaha, and it has a difference of 920 Krupp between both shells. At 12 kilometers, the difference in penetration is 36 millimeters. Everything else about these ships is exactly the same. They are the exact same guns. They're the exact same shells, like physically in real life. It's the basically the manufacturing quality of the shell and the drag coefficient that are dictating the penetration. So if you ever play a sister ship, be careful to read what's going on with it, because one ship could have insanely better guns than the other, and you just wouldn't know why. But there's little stuff squirreled away like this, and Wargaming makes adjustments to drag coefficient and Krupp and things like that all the time in order to make soft behind the scenes little back end changes to gun mechanics without really making a massive like dev blog or patch note worthy change, so that ships kind of stay within their parameters. It's kind of like their way of balancing with a scalpel. There's been times recorded where I think it was on Hotnik 4 patches in a row. A couple months after she was released, her Krupp changed. Like it went up by 10, down by 15, up by 20, down by 10. It was weird, but they do things like that all the time. So if you ever feel like your guns are doing something wonky, they probably messed with one of these things like Krupp.
What is crop again?
It's a value that mathematically rationalizes the manufacturing quality of the shell. So there's, for example, Shikash- uh, Shikishima has, I think it's like a 1,000 Krupp or something like that. It's super weak, and you can actually shatter against Kremlin's belt at long ranges with it, because the shell quality is so weak. It shatters apart on the belt. Um, some ships that have higher Krupp have the ability to go through armor plates with a little more tenacity. So it's kind of a soft value, but it also it's weird. Like it's not like the most important one, but once again, it's the manufacturing quality of the shell and basically how hard it is when it goes to impact a piece of armor. Does that help clear that up?
I actually, thank you.
All right.
Yeah, I sorry, my English not so good, but thank you.
Oh, it's fine. It's
I
fine.
think it help. It's a soft value. It has a part in it. The higher the value, I felt like what I understand was the shell is tougher, so it doesn't shatter more, something like that.
Yep, that's pretty much how it works. It's basically how good the steel is. Higher the Krupp, the
Got
stronger the steel. Lower the Krupp, the weaker the steel. And it's just taking a real life concept and putting it to a number.
thank you.
So part three, a shell's flight. As we can see here, Canaris is firing her shell. I don't have Canaris in the screenshot, but this Canaris firing her shells towards an enemy ship on the map border. So this is a pretty short section here, but it's an important one. So as your shell's flying through the air, a couple things happen to it. First, as we mentioned, the speed reduction. So as soon as you fire, your shell starts slowing down. This will affect your penetration later. If your shell is moving at 200 meters per second, you're going to shatter, you're going to bounce, you're going to do some weird crap. If it's moving at 800 meters per second, you're probably going to penetrate something unless you have a caliber difference, right? But for the most part, this is a very big part of how your shells get to their target. And then trajectory. So trajectory is the elevation and depression of your gun combined with the dispersion and the sigma, which dictate the path that your shell is going to take from where you fired to where it's fired from to the point in which you aimed. This is arbitrary and it's not really a mechanic. This is just the immediate effect of your actions and what you did. So in this case, for the next slide is uh, this relates to both travel time and flight time. So, for example, if a ship has high velocity, low air drag, light shells, and low elevation, like the ship on the right, it'll have a very fast flight time. If you have a ship with a low velocity, a high air drag, heavy shells at a high elevation, they will have slow flight times, like the ship on the right. The ship on the left is more akin to something like a Petro, and the ship on the left is on more like a Des Moines, and the ship on the right is more like a Petro. So uh, this is important because if you have, let's say, a flat trajectory that's, let's say, long range, let's say you have a 20-kilometer flat trajectory, let's say you're firing out of Des Moines because we're going to decide to change it for whatever reason. Um, you'll have these comically slow shells that are going to be like going at like 400 meters per second at the end of their flight, and they're just going to be like hovering midair as they go along. Not that that would ever like be something that would happen, but at the end of the day, like that's just why like the range is changed for different shells so that it looks more reasonable as they go to strike. But at the end of the day, they're both arbitrary. But it's why you see certain shells behaving in certain ways. All right. So now getting into when shells actually strike. There's three different kinds of shells, and first up we're going to talk about is armor-piercing shells. So in this example, we've talked about it being fired. The shell had its attributes given to it. It flew, and now it's hitting. And let's say, for example, it's an AP shell. The first thing that's going to happen is it's going to check for overmatch. So overmatch is either referred to as overmatch or the caliber divided by 14.3 measure or the 14.3 rule. Regardless, basically, if the caliber is 14.3 times larger than the armor plate, it will penetrate through irrespective to other attributes of the mechanic. So basically, irrespective to the angle, irrespective to if it has enough ability to penetrate through the armor or not. That's what the overmatch is checking for. On the left here, we have a really nice chart here. This is pulled off of the World of Warships wiki of armor thicknesses and the AP diameter needed to overmatch. Right now, currently it's only incomparable Satsuma and Shigashima that can overmatch 35 millimeters due to their caliber size. For the most part, that's just about as big as things really can get. HE shells are a little different though. HE shells have the ability to penetrate, uh, but we'll talk about what those do a little bit later. But for the most part, this is the AP. There's also some common thresholds here that you see, like getting through 30 millimeter plating and getting through 32 millimeter plating. Uh, for example, 32 millimeter plating hosts Slava's deck plating. So, if you guys want, you can take a screenshot of this. But for the most part, this is the armor thicknesses as shown on the left column there. Those are pretty much your benchmark thicknesses of common occurrences that you will see pop up when uh, firing your guns. Next, impact angle. Shells impact at different angles to a piece of armor. There are 3 regions per shell. The standard area, and this is where the shell will always penetrate the armor if it has the ability to do so. The gray area, this is where the ricochet chance starts, and this is there's basically a dice roll if your shell will bounce or not. And then the bouncing area, this is where shells will always bounce, so this is basically the guaranteed spot. Um, Impact angle is only calculated if a shell cannot overmatch the armor. If it does overmatch the armor, this step is skipped because there's no need for it to check it because the shell is so much bigger than the plate of armor. It doesn't matter what it strikes. The armor is going to fail against the shell. And as you can see here, just I guess a little cool thing to point out because I always love this nonsense that Wargame decided to do. Tanchibana has a 91 degree normal basically bounce angle. This means that the shells never bounce, and it's just a kind of a gimmick that the ship has. Tanjibana's guns are also weak as hell, so this is kind of a pity thing, if anything else. It does make me wonder if on the back end mechanics, if there is some sort of way that the game handles if a shell hits at a 92-degree angle. I don't know if that's ever a thing, but like I'd love to just ask a developer that in person. It would just be a cool thing to know. But anyway, most ships have a 45 and then 60-degree ricochet angle for AP, and then this is an exhaustive list of all occurrences where that does not happen for armor-piercing shells specifically. SAP shells also have different ricochet angles, and we'll talk about that in the SAP section.
Super
So,
quick and super quick and new question. So most ship has 45 to 60. So
yeah,
if I use the mod that said, oh, my enemy is 45-degree from me, this is it. I can absolutely pen it, right?
uh, no, at 45 degrees exact, that's where the ricochet chance will start. It's technically 44.9 degrees and less, but it rounds to 45. Um, but if you're at so if you're impacting at 45.1, you have a chance to ricochet. If it's at 44.9, it'll pen. 45 is where it will start to check for a ricochet or roll for a ricochet.
Okay, thank you.
And as we see here, there's an example of how different trajectories will affect whether or not this AP is going to bounce or not. So, for example, on the left-hand side here, we have more of a very flat trajectory shell, and on a horizontal piece of armor, there is a simple bounce, but on a vertical piece of armor, it penetrates through. On the right-hand side, plunging fire ricochets off of horizontal piece of armor, and a vertical piece of armor. My apologies. And on a horizontal piece of armor, it's able to penetrate through. This obviously assumes that the shell has enough ability to penetrate through the armor, but if it can, this is just basically what will occur. So next, shell normalization then occurs. This is basically corrects the angle of the shell and sucks it in nose first, which is, I guess, the best way I could come up to describe that. On the right-hand side here, there's a chart. This is a standardized for all ships based on their caliber of how much it deflects into the ship. It's pretty standard per caliber. There's no exceptions based on if you're a like super cruiser or if you're battle cruiser or whatnot or any of that jazz. It's purely based on caliber alone. Um, if the angle is successful when a penetration is calculated with the natural penetration of the shell. The natural pen is basically the caliber, velocity, weight, and Krupp all mashed together, and that's what does the penetration. So to break it down further, the caliber pen is, unless stated otherwise, it's 1/6 of the shell when penetrating. Velocity is how fast it's moving at the time it strikes the armor. The weight is how heavy the shell is and indicates how much energy it retains passing through. And Krupp, once again, is a value representing the quality of the material the shell is made of. If one of these is insufficient to pen, then the shell will shatter against the plate because it does not have because together they do not equal a penetration value great enough for the shell to break through the armor at the angle it's hitting. For example, here in the example on the right, we'll talk about this in the next slide because there's something called relative armor thickness. But as you can see here, the degree here, the 50 degrees, is the original trajectory that it was off of from parallel, and the red is the new trajectory it's on based on normalization. So that is just a way to visualize what's happening. The shell's just kind of scooping into the armor there. So next, relative thickness. So as the shell goes through each layer of armor, it reduces its penetration value by subtracting the armor layer it just went through from the penetration capacity of the shell. If a shell hits the plate on armor plate on an angle, it runs into something called the relative thickness. So, for example, if a shell hits a 200 millimeter piece of armor on a 50-degree angle, and the armor, let's say in this example, has a relative thickness of 250 millimeters. If yours shell has a 201 millimeters of penetration, you won't go through the plate because the shell's impacting on an angle, and it physically can't go through the angle because the armor, there's just too much metal in the way, right? So if you wanted to hit the shell at basically hit the horizontal into the vertical plate, and that's what you're trying to hit, then your 201 millimeter penetration ability would go through the 200 millimeter plate, and the shell would basically arm and explode in the compartment. And that brings us to the next part, shell fuse. So all shells have a fuse, and it's affected by two parts. The detonator fuse threshold, which is the name of the back-end piece of data. A shell has to pass through a minimum of a sixth of its caliber, or whatever that requirement. Some ships, it's different to start its fuse, and the detonator time. Detonator time is how long a ship lives before it. Lives before it explodes. Most fuses are 0.033 seconds. Some ships have a faster fuse time. Some have a slower fuse time, but most fuses are around this. You don't really want to worry about your fuse too much because you'll kind of go down to a crazy rabbit hole of mechanics. But if you ever wonder why you overpen something, which we'll get into in a bit, this is basically what that's related to. So once the shell triggers its timer, it hits more plates of armor, and it will repeat steps 2 and 3 about checking the angle and penetrating through, and if it still has enough penetration, subtracting from those plates as it goes through, until either it runs out of time and explodes inside the compartment, or if it massively hits something and internally shatters, which normally shells don't internally shatter in things like the Citadel and whatnot. Normally shells don't shatter on them unless they're mostly exposed, but once they go inside of a compartment of the ship, they'll explode in there and they'll do their damage. So, over-penetrating a target. There's two ways that this can happen for an AP shell. Either a shell does not pass through enough armor to set the fuse and passes through the ship without exploding, or the shell passes through enough armor to set the fuse, but the flight time is so fast and the fuse timer is long enough to where the shell does not get a chance to explode inside the ship because it still has penetration value and it just flies right outside the ship. Basically, how the game rationalizes this, we'll talk about more in another section. But basically, once the shell leaves the ship and it quote unquote explodes outside the ship, technically the armor's resisted against the AP payload blast. How this is coded in game, though, is that once the shell physically leaves the ship's model, once it's interacted with it, either a ricochet or an overpen, the game code literally kills the combat ability of the shell and just terminated right there. So you'll either see the model just kind of discard away or go poof, but at the end of the day, once the shell leaves the ship, it's done. It cannot damage another ship. So, part 5. Semi-armor piercing shells. Now, from looking at the backend statistics for these, SAP shells are basically lazy AP. Um, I know, I know. It seems like no, duh, Marauder. Like that's what they're designed. But in terms of how they're actually coded, we'll bring some stuff up here. This basically is the same thing as the AP. They first go through an overmatch check, and then they go through an impact check. But on the right-hand side here, we see that there's actually a much bigger difference in where they can ricochet. So compared to the majority of your AP shells, SAP shells have a 16 to 90 degree field where they can penetrate, which is massive compared to the 46 to 90. They have a 5-degree window of a gray area, and then the bounce area is only 10 degrees. So, for example, let's say you're facing Napoli secondaries. The best way to deal with them is to just charge the ship straight on, because that's literally all you can do. But they'll still penetrate through your superstructure or whatnot. But when you're dealing with any ship, for that matter, with SAP, head-on is the only way that you're going to ever bounce them. Otherwise, for the most part, they're probably going to get into your ship. Normalization will also still occur, and that's where, once again, we talked about before, it gets sucked in nose first. SAP shells ignore Krupp weight and velocity. The only time Krupp weight and velocity impact a SAP shell is during its flight time. That's it. And the values are still there to normalize the flight time mechanic. And then SAP shells have a super fast fuse timer. And the thing is that while people say that, well, obviously Wargaming says that the shell just fuse, as soon as it passes a piece of armor, it explodes. Well, like physically, the way that the values are manipulated, it's true. But the way that it's coded in the back end is that they have a 0.0001 fuse timer. So they essentially will explode once they go through the first piece of armor that they are able to fuse on. But just the way it's coded, it's basically just AP shells with their back end statistics and variables and coefficients reworked to make SAP shells behave the way that they do. As we can see here, there's different ricochet chances for certain ships. Nino Bixo has a very funny ricochet angle here of 80 to 85. And this is because the gun caliber on the ship, I believe, is so abysmally poor that otherwise the guns are just unusable. But for all of the cruisers, except for Napoli, because Napoli doesn't have SAP in the main guns, it begins at 70 and ricochet is guaranteed at 80. The Americans also have a very unique SAP with 65 to 75 for Austin for Sherman. I don't remember the values on San Diego per the dev blog, but I believe she's getting the same treatment here, where American SAP is going to have this weird 65-75 value. Italian destroyers have a 60-75 value as well. There's this 5-degree difference between the two. Why? Who knows? But this is what's been decided for the balancing of the game. Some of these are also arbitrary based on how much damage that these parts do. So next, the wonderful world of high explosive shells. We're going to be talking about all the jazz with these, and when these HE shells impact a ship, unlike AP or SAP, they do not really check for penetration very much. They check for basically how much they can basically what was the word I wanted to use for this? Basically, they're checking whether or not they're going to either shatter or explode and deal damage to a compartment or section. So basically, you take a caliber, right? So, for example, the Japanese have a 100 millimeter caliber for some of their guns, and they get applied the 3/10 rule. So it's 30 millimeters of penetration for the HE shell. There's a couple ships that follow the quarter rule here. Some share the 1/5 rule, but most have the 1/6 rule. So, for example, in here, we take a 127 millimeter shell from a destroyer, and it gets rounded down because once you divide it by 6 and to 21 millimeters. So, if a shell hits a 21 millimeter or lower plate, it'll fuse and it'll explode. Any piece of armor you strike that's bigger than this, basically the armor plate is resisting the high explosive payload of the shell, which means that the uh, payload doesn't damage the actual compartment. It only the damage of the shell only is going to damage uh, that compartment which you hit. When we get to the high explosive cube, we're going to talk about later, that does not damage other sections, unlike torpedoes, which do, because torpedoes get handled separately. We're not talking about them today, but just pointing that out if for people who may have that in the back of their mind. Um, this is a non-exhaustive list of occurrences of uh, millimeters of armor thickness and what can pen it. Right now, the only thing that can Citadel and Audacious with HE is Thunderer and Hanover, which is I find kind of funny because of course Thunderer can do that, right? What can it not do? But for the most part, this information can also be found in the World of Warships wiki. I will drop a link to it for anyone who's not acquainted with the website in the general chat of the server when I'm done with the seminar, so that you guys can really dig into this. We're also going to be talking about IFHE a little bit later on in the lecture, but basically, uh, it increases the penetration capacity of the shell and reduces your fire chance by half, so that you can fuse on a bigger piece of armor with your HE shell. Next, after the shell does the damage check, the penetration check, and then it damages the compartment, the next mathematical check is for fire chance. So every HE shell has a percent fire chance to start a fire. It's calculated per section of the ship that it hits. The fire, if a fire is burning on a section impacted, this step is going to be entirely ignored. So basically, if fire equals true, then the step just gets skipped entirely. For all you guys out there who are, I guess, more knowledgeable about tick rate, there's no perceivable correlation at this time between whether or not if a fire goes out in the middle of a tick of the server or not, whether you can set a fire on that same part of that ship within the same tick. There's nothing conclusive of that, but I would assume that if a fire goes out in one tick of the server, then the next tick of the server, that's when you can set a fire. And if a shell lands within the tick of a server while a fire was going out, then the fire chance wouldn't be calculated within that tick. I'm not too sure on that, but it seems like based on all the information that I've gone over, it looks like that's the way it's designed. Anyway, so every ship has a natural fire chance resistance coefficient, and this is basically how flammable each part of the ships are. Carriers all get the same value of 0.8, and basically all of the stuff you see here gets plugged into a mathematical formula that the game immediately calculates every time an HE shell does its fire chance roll and determines whether or not you'll set a fire on a ship or not. This can also be found on the wiki. I'll give you guys just a minute here if you want to screenshot this or not, and then we'll be moving on to the next slide. So, the high explosive cube. The high explosive cube is then calculated after the fire chance roll occurs. And all the stuff, by the way, we talked about between the damage, between the fuse check and then the damage being dealt and the fire chance and now this cube, all happens in like the blink of an eye. But this is just the order of which the operations happen. So basically, the epicenter of the cube is from the point where the shell strikes any object in the game. Notably, like it says, any object. It can strike an island, it can strike your ship, it can strike the water, whatever. The blast cube will encompass modules on the ship, and they deal damage based on 2 factors. So they compare. First one is it compares 2 different coefficients: blast protection, which is listed as armor coefficient, and it's a coefficient rationalizing how tough the module is. And then there's something called the blast penetration, which is the splash armor coefficient. This rationalizes how strong the shockwave of the blast is. Blast protection is a positive number, and blast penetration is a negative number. If the sum of these 2 numbers is greater than 0, damage is dealt. If it's equal to or less than 0, the module resists damage. So technically, based on how the game works, you could take an entire entire Thunderous salvo to your magazine, and if the magazine has enough resistance to the shell, you'll never lose any damage to your magazine, and you'll never detonate. In the most hypothetical of scenarios here. But basically, it's kind of a way to make it a little more fair so that um, destroyers, if you will, they're the easiest example in this, don't take it in the short so often compared to other ships. The alpha damage, which is a value for HE shells that um, basically is how powerful that shockwave, once it's true, like mathematically proven true that you can damage the module, basically how impactful that damage is. This damage is what's taken away from the HP of the module, not your shell damage. Every ship has an alpha damage value for its HE shells if it has HE shells. Um, and as you can see in the nice bold text here, it is possible for HE shells that do not hit a ship to destroy it per detonating it. So you can deplete the entire magazine module with an explosive cube. It's also possible for an HE shell exploding outside of the match boundaries to damage a model. So if you're getting shot at by HE and you're riding the border, you could be damaged. Thus, it's possible to be killed via a detonation from damage originating outside the map. The reason I'm bringing this up is because there's plenty of people who have, wild stuff happens to them in the match and they think it's all voodoo magic. No. It's very possible that you can be damaged from damage outside the part of the map. Wargaming is not just applying some random RNG to your ship. Is it a little frustrating? Sure, but it is how the game is coded and how the mechanic works. As we can see here, here's a pictographical representation of the life of an HE shell. So the moment that it hits, the cube is then formed. The high explosive cube covers the modules that it can damage, and then the high explosive cube is being resisted by a module that has the ability to resist the splash armor coefficient. Now, Wargaming says that any module covered in 76 millimeters or greater doesn't get damaged by the HE cube blast. Mathematically, on paper, this is untrue. This is a game design choice. Technically, if they wanted to, they could modify the values to where Yamato's gun could be disabled by the HE cube of Erie's gun for whatever freaking reason it decided to. But this is just a design choice that it's about 76 millimeters is what's safe from the high explosive cube in the game.
Super quick question. So for that, if I shoot my shell like between 2 Corning tower on the middle of the picture, the middle picture last screen, my shell would do damage because it has a cube that do the damage.
Yes.
Like
So
the middle picture. Yeah.
yeah, so basically a cube is then formed from the center, from basically the tip of where your shell hits. A cube is then formed. And
So when the cube form, my shell definitely will damage, right? Even though the shell might
so
go between 2
the
Corning
shell is
tower.
the shell is going to apply damage to the basically to the superstructure section of your ship, the entire hull section of your ship. Those two are going to take damage traditionally and go against your HP bar. Then the high explosive cube is going to apply the alpha damage, which is a separate number, against in this case, the AA guns and the secondary guns, and in this case, they are destroyed because there is too much for them to resist, so they are going to be destroyed. The turret here is within that, but the coefficient of the armor is higher than the coefficient of the blast cube, so the armor of the armored turret resists the cube. Therefore, that module, that gun, does not take damage from your HE shell.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
So, below water damage. So, there's two kinds of it, but unlike the depth charges, as modeled here by Bliss Wicca, shells damage submarines entirely differently, as we see Jura here gunning down a submarine that just had gone off of visual. So, all shells have a value for damaging subs that basically it's how your shells do damage underwater specifically. They're not listed as sub damage in the game files. I don't know why. I guess in case Wargaming has some other need for them to do something different. But basically, you get a splash radius that's which is basically how big the AoE is per shell that's applied that each shell has. And then each shell has a splash damage coefficient. And this is multiplied by the alpha damage of each shell, and the result is applied to the enemy ship, in this case, the enemy submarine. So, AP and SAP alpha only damages submarines and does not affect modules. And the only time that these shells damage a module is if they directly strike it, and in that case, they deal the shell's listed damage against the module. HE shells are special, where their alpha damage will get multiplied by the splash damage coefficient and damage submarines, and their alpha damage also, like we saw in the last couple slides, will be applied to the modules from the high explosive cube. So alpha damage on HE does double duty. Alpha damage on AP and SAP only damages subs. Based on other bits of backend data, your HE and SAP do a better job of damaging submarines than AP does, but if you have AP loaded, fire it, because subs are very slippery and hard to get. Want to point out here as well, this is like the only slide on this topic. I really would have liked to go in more in depth on this, but Wargaming keeps changing how submarines work constantly, and I would have to start talking about depth charges and whatnot and getting into that to elaborate on this topic. So, if anyone has any other questions about this kind of damage, I guess we'll bring them up now because this is kind of where this starts and stops a little bit.
I have a super quick question about the backend data. Where do you get it? How do you get it?
So there's people who have made some Reddit posts where they've data mined some of this information based on what the values are of how these things do damage. And then there's sites like Wouse Gamer Blog, which will post some of this information as well because they do a little bit of data mining and whatnot. So that's where I get some of that from. And then Game Model 3D has all of the ships and their some of their backend data as well, which I get that from. That requires you to buy a subscription to, well, not a subscription, but you pay like a one-time fee to use that website. But it's a permanent one-time fee kind of thing.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
All right, so part 8, other important mechanics here. So this actually opens up for my first thing here. So we have here Haida, Mysore, and Changmu, and all of these have a sister ship in game. But it doesn't always mean that their statistics are just the same because they exist and because they're sister ships. So sometimes it works out to be true. For example, all 4 Fletcher class ships have the exact same AP characteristics across every single one, while the difference between Fiji and Mysore is pretty different. They have a difference in shell weight, they have a difference in damage, a difference in speed, difference in air drag, everything, the whole 9 yards. So they're sister ships with 2 entirely separate different mechanics. While as with ships like Haida and Cossack, which are both tribal class destroyers, they have the same weight, different damage, same speed, same drag, same flight time, same impact speed, same impact angle, but their fire chance is different between 5% for Haida and 8% for Cossack, which changes your fires from 3.6 on Haida to 7.7 on Cossack. So always do your research on guns between sister ships. Just because it's the same hull and the same ship doesn't mean shit. There's going to be a difference somewhere along the line, and if it's not, like in the case of the Fletcher classes, woohoo, that's phenomenal. If it's not, in the same as the Fiji and the Mysore, you have to be a little more careful, and it changes what you can shoot at and what you can tackle in the course of a battle. So, other important mechanics. If a shell overpens a ship, it may not penetrate another ship. Once the tip of the model of the shell leaves the ship, The offensive abilities of the ship are terminated. If a shell ricochets off the ship, same thing. The offensive abilities are immediately terminated. A shell that ricochets cannot kill you. So if you've ever been hit by a shell and you think it ricocheted off another ship and it's some sort of mystical bullshit, it's not. That never happened. Someone else shot you. AP shells start arming in water if they hit the water. It can be used to score below the waterline hits on lightly armored targets. Water does not have a thickness and pretty much fully fuses shells for the most part. Shells that arm in water can still overmatch ship's armor. Armor does not affect the overmatch penetration mechanic. Arming only affects how long that shell has to live. Those are two entirely separated points. Shells that break through a torpedo belt but cannot enter the compartments of the ship are considered as an internal shatter. You may have received that ribbon before when you're shooting at a target. That's what that's from. High explosive cube for HE shells can damage the modules of two ships at once. This is the only time a shell can double dip, basically damaging two different boats at the same time. There is no other occurrence where your shells can magically damage two ships at once. There's not some magical voodoo nonsense that lets you do that. Once the shell hits a ship, it only interacts with that ship. It's the high explosive cube, however, that's a little different with that. Likewise, since I did mention it earlier, the torpedo cube that forms when you get a torp strike on something, that cannot damage two different ships at once. It can only damage the ship where the torpedo struck. So there's some differences there if anyone was wondering. Other important information. So penetration deals 33% of a shell's listed damage, less when there's saturation, whether it's AP or HE or SAP. They must penetrate the armor and detonate inside the ship. Over penetration deals 10% of the shell's listed damage to the section of the ship it hit. So it'll damage 10% to the compartment and then 10% to the overall HP hull section. Citadel hits will always deal 100% of the shell's listed damage. Though you can still overpen a Citadel, which will deal only 10% of the damage. The shell has to explode inside of the Citadel in order to deal that damage. Just because the shell touches it doesn't mean it does it. Likewise, if your shell bounces off the Citadel armor inside the ship and explodes inside a different compartment, just because your shell physically touched the Citadel does not mean that the ship receives Citadel damage as well. It has to actually blow up inside of it. Shells don't disarm once they cross the map border. Ordnance is considered live within the game environment unless it hits the ship, water, or a solid object. This is why you can take damage from a shell while you're, sticking outside the map border and a shell kind of arcs over the border and hits your bow or whatever. So just because you're across the border doesn't mean you're safe. If shells are not explicitly aimed at you, they can still damage your ship. So don't stand in front of other ships while they're being shot at, or basically it's the same as if you're on detection and getting shot at. The shells will do just the same amount of damage. They'll do the same amount of mechanics and all that jazz. You're not protected from it. And there's super ships, which we all know about, star tier or tier 11, depending on whatever terminology someone decides to use these days. They have special mechanics that alter firing parameters. Make sure to read these before using them in battle and know how they work. So, part 9, influencing shell mechanics. A couple niche examples here. So, for example, Vertibus Unitus can get 25% fire chance per shell with both signal flags. Goliath has the highest cruiser HE pen in the game when IFHE is applied at 73 millimeters. And Austin can get 10% more damage to both of her shell types with a single captain skill. The thing about IFHE and Goliath, by the way, that's not an inherent recommendation. That's just a cool little tidbit of how things work. So there's a few ways that we can modify the behavior of our shells and what they do. Modules like Aiming System 1, Aiming System 0 for select Japanese ships, Artillery Plotting Room Modification 2 for American battleships, all to decrease the ellipsoid size. And then if you run range mod, it pushes the maximum size of your dispersion ellipsoid farther back, meaning that you're going to be more accurate at the same ranges. So, if, for example, with the Fuso, for the 4 kilometers, it's still going to be 100 meters, but at 21 kilometers, it may not be still I think it was 272 was the number. For the size of the ellipsoid, it may be something smaller, like say 180 for a number, and the more extended range is going to be um, that original size. I know Fuso can't mount the range mod. This is just an offhand example because we used it earlier. You can also use the spotting aircraft, which will extend your range as well. And this allows you to kind of do the same thing, but it does change the angle in which you see the map. So make sure that you get comfortable with that gunnery because the camera angle is separate from your normal camera angle. There are also other mods that improve the shell mechanics and also improve just the handling of your guns as well. For example, the reload time for your ship can be reduced using the main battery mod 3 or using the main battery reload booster. And you can improve the traverse speed of your guns using main battery mod 2 if you so wish to. You can also make your guns more survivable and easier to repair by using main armaments mod 1. Now, I know, super big list, but this is some of the legendary mods that tier 10s have. And they give up whatever could go in that slot in exchange for this unique upgrade parameter. But you want to be careful about what some of these ships modules do. For example, this one is from Kleber, improved camouflage patterns. You think, man, I'll just be more stealthy, right? Well, you'll be stealthier, but you also come with an 80% main battery reload penalty. So you might want to think about what this is going to do to your ship when it changes. Or, for example, enhanced engineering systems from Conquer. This one increases your main battery traverse speed by 13%, but also changes your rudder shift and steering gear repair time. There's also other ships, for example, I believe Zhao here. It's a main battery firing range of 8 kilometers improvements and changes the shell dispersion by negative 7. So it shrinks that shell dispersion of that ellipsoid physically inward. So make sure you read any of the upgrades you put on your ship. They can have an unintended side effect. And it's going to change something, and you may not like what it does, or it may be something you intentionally take. But reading is your friend, and reading is OP. So do that. This is list of captain skills, but captain skills can also change the ability of what your ship can do. So, for example, as I mentioned earlier, you can put heavy HE and SAP shells on Austin to improve the damage of both the shell types, and that's great. But keep in mind, it's going to change the detectability of the ship a little bit here. So be careful with that. You have super heavy AP shells here, where they'll for battleships. This will increase the damage by 7.5%, but the fire extinguishing and flooding recovery time goes up by 25%. So be careful. You'll be a little more hazardous to be more of a hazard to DOT damage. So once again, make sure you read what you're doing. But for the most part, these offer some pretty nice buffs for the different ships that you can apply them to. I misspoke here because this penalty only applies to 149 millimeters and greater. Austin is a 127 millimeter gunship, so this does not apply to it. But the point still stands. Be careful and make sure you're picking picks deliberately. Some captains have improved captain skills. For example, on the left here, we have Adrenaline Rush that's improved. We have Grease the Gears that's improved. So these will have like a little bit better statistics here. And these can be used to squeeze just a little bit more performance out of your guns on a ship that you may not be having that great of a time with for a nation. So if you have the ability to put these on, they may be the difference between you losing your mind or your ship getting that little extra bit of performance out of it. Over on the right here, we have some different talent abilities. These are abilities that legendary commanders have, and they will improve the ability of your ship when you meet a certain condition in battle. For example, this one is from oh man, I blew a blank. Lugents. When you hit 104, enemy ship 104 times with the main battery, you reduce the reload time by 7.5% for your guns. And when that stacks with things like Adrenaline Rush and a reload mod, you get some better, ability to put shells down range. So when you build a captain, make sure you incorporate some of these things to help out your ships that have gunnery that's lacking or gunnery that you feel that it needs a little more improvement on so you can do more damage throughout the battle. Influencing shell mechanics. There are 2 flags that improve the fire chance of your ship's HE shells. Remember to read all the modifiers before using them. For example, India X-ray, this will increase your ability to detonate by 5%. So make sure you have Juliet Charlie on there, or yikes, that could be the end of the match for you if you hit the wrong way. All right, and the last bit here, we're almost done with the seminar. Shell RNG. Yes, nice pictures of pretty beautiful ships. I'm supposed to say 4 there, but there's 4 RNG factors that affect shells in game. Fire chance. RNG dice rolls that protect the internal modules of HE shells. So I talked with Little White Mouse about this in a correspondence with her, and she said that there's this, that Sub Octavian said it was true, but did not confirm how it works. That there's this kind of RNG dice roll that'll sometimes affect critical modules like your rudders and engine and your magazines from taking damage. And this kind of thing exists mainly for like destroyers and whatnot to protect them, so that they just don't get pummeled by bigger ships and whatnot, and kind of have a little extra added layer to fight back with. There's really not much more information besides him just saying that. So I'm not really sure how much else that kind of plays out to, but for the most part, that does exist as a thing. Gaussian distribution in relation to the sigma parameter, and the gray area bounce angles for shells, and that's it. And this next part I underscore, and this isn't like a thing being said to be mean, but this is a thing to said because it always comes up every time anyone ever talks about shell mechanics in any capacity. And I'm bringing it up just to squash it outright. There's no hidden or secret RNG factor that affects your shells outside these parts. All the shell mechanics are entirely a mechanical affair from input-output. Any failure your shell's not doing something you want to do is because either you don't know how to aim, you don't know how to aim the shots for your specific ship, the enemy's reacting to your attack in a way that's unsatisfactory for your goals, the shells of your ship are being incapable of working under the conditions you're putting them, or this target that you're selecting, the shells are not designed to combat that. That's pretty much what's happening if you're getting a result you don't like on the field. Otherwise, it's the only 4 RNG factors are pretty minimal compared to that. So don't get, and what this is basically driving at is don't get mad at your guns. If your guns miss your target, or if you're just not able to hit something, or if the enemy's dodging, load your guns up and fire again. Don't get mad. Don't get upset. The Wargaming Boogeyman is not out to get you and screw up your games and try to make you mad so you spend more money in the game. There's none of that nonsense is going on. All of it is clearly an input-output affair. And if you control the input-output, if you take the time to know how your guns work, you will be the one in control of what you're able to do on the field. If you want your gunnery to improve, you have to aim better. You have to understand how your guns work. That's just what it falls on at the end of the day. So don't get mad. There ain't no magical ghost trying to screw you up. All right? And with that, that's the entire presentation. Thank you guys so much for attending. I've talked for an hour and 10 minutes now, as per the PowerPoint presenter view telling me how long. It's been. I know this has been a very long presentation for a lot of people, but hopefully, for the veteran players out there, this gave you some insight to game mechanics that you didn't already have before, and kind of demystified some back-end values. And to newer players, I hope this taught you more about shell mechanics and helped you understand and helped you get a better grasp of what they do and how they work.
One quick addition to your last part of the, dumb in, dumb out, or good in, good out. The other part of that is, of course, whether or not the player you're firing at is outthinking you. Because if you fire your shells and then all of a sudden he hits the gas one way or the other, then he can miss your shells sometimes, depending on the ship, how quick it is.
Correct.
Hey.
And that just kind of falls into when, the enemy reacts in a way that you don't like. Like that's not your guns misbehaving. That's just them playing the game in return, right? It's
Right.
a PvP game, and people sometimes forget that, human players are as unpredictable as random numbered dice rolls. So
That's the enemy having incoming fire alert as well.
Yeah, if you have the incoming fire alert
and
shell,
targeting.
it will make it easier to dodge shells, even though you don't always need incoming fire alert. But if they do have it, it gives them a little extra advantage.
All right.
Uh, is
Bercy,
there
Question. Oh,
any more questions or?
yes,
yeah, I got a question. Oh,
I
go ahead.
have. Go ahead.
Does the sequence of fire have an effect on accuracy? So like sequential firing or just salvo dumping?
No. The dispersion is calculated per turret. So if I fire 3 of my guns in the next 3, and like 2 different brackets, they will have each of them are going to draw their dispersion alone. Obviously, greater shell groupings at the better opportunity give you a better chance of hitting the target when it's in an opportune state. But I will not have different dispersion because I fired 1 turret versus 4 or 6 or however many I have.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Can we go to part 7? I believe it was the second slide that for the underwater kill army mechanics. Have there been like any recent changes, like in the past, like 2 patches of how AP going on the waterline, just touching the waterline, being armed?
Ah, so are you asking about submarines or asking about underwater penetrations to ships? Because those are 2 separate
Two
things.
chips, two ships.
All right, so that would be in part. That would be in part 8. So that would be
Oh,
here. Um,
uh-huh.
yeah. So basically, uh, when a shell hits the water, it starts fusing, and the fuse timer starts. If the timer doesn't go off by time the shell still has enough momentum to hit the ship and get through the armor, then it'll explode inside the ship and damage the ship. If the shell explodes in the water, the armor will resist the blast, and the ship will not take damage from the shell. If it's an armor-piercing shell, if it's an HE shell, it'll still be subjected to the high explosive cube, module damage, and all of that. But if it's an AP shell or a SAP shell, it'll fuse in the water and then go off as soon as that hits. Pretty much.
And there's no way to get from the torpedo. Oh, yeah, okay. From
Yeah, so you can use the water to like help fuse your shell so that you go through lighter armored targets so that it kind of absorbs some of the energy of the shell. That's kind of a trick you can use, but you obviously have to practice that quite a bit before it becomes like second nature to you.
Water have no thickness. Shells never arm when they hit the water.
So
It's in a wargaming video from 3 years ago, buddy. They have plenty of these things right over there. You don't have to use wiki.
well, yeah, but
Water do not have thickness. Every shell who go to the water, if you whatever blah 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 it is, it's same like flying in the air.
yes.
That's why citadeling ships. If you're shell farming in the water, you're not gonna hit citadels, brother. It's logical.
Well, if you're shooting at a light cruiser and your shells hit just before the ship itself, and let's say you're Yamato, your AP has a very good chance at a close range of overpenning a cruiser, the water will slow down the shell. So the water slows down its travel, and it fuses the shell. But the water doesn't have thickness, therefore it doesn't change the penetration of the shell, in terms of its caliber or in terms of its weight or in terms of its crup. But in terms of its velocity, that will affect a little bit of it, but it doesn't change really the armor penetration capacity of the shell.
okay.
So you said that if some ship has citadel under the water, I can aim under the water and it will citadel it too?
If you have the penetration to do so, yes. If you do not have the penetration to do so, you will not citadel the ship.
Okay, thank you. I have a question. Can we go to the slide where you have like a ship and then the ellipsoid?
Okay, yeah, I can do that real quick.
Thank you.
This
Right.
one?
Yes, thank you. So so I don't know if I'm imagining it, and I want your help. When I completely broadside and then I shoot, and then the shell has where they land, the ellipse within the ellipsoid, and then the dispersion and the other mechanic that make it land where it is. I wonder, and then there's where the shell come off, which is where the three spot of the turret for that ship that you show on here, right? I
Yeah.
wonder what if no, what if the shell on the left, the ship on the left, if I angle it and make the shell fire so the turret is kind of closer to one another, would it make the grouping and the dispersion of the shell like more together instead of more separate than when I shoot the shell at a ship when my ship is broadside?
No. The
In
angle
other
of it,
words, narrower and longer versus spread
it
out.
yeah, it will not. I know what you're talking about. It will
You
not.
get an oval per turret,
Yeah,
so
it's
that wouldn't affect it.
yeah, because it's an oval per
Oh,
turret. Yeah, so this only shows 3 of them because if it was all 6, it would be a little more confusing with the lines. But basically, when you fire at an enemy, if it's drawn per turret, it's not going to matter. What's going to matter is where you're aiming in relation to where it's drawn and where it's put, right?
So in real life, it would make a difference, but in the game, the way it's
Yeah,
coded, it won't.
yeah, in the game it will not make a difference.
thank you so much.
Is there any other questions we had?
Real quick about the last part. The single fire versus all fire. I typically do all fire, and I'm not the best shot in the world. I have my good games and my bad games, but one thing you can consider when you're firing, if you're parallel to another ship, going at the same speed, side by side, then probably all guns are probably the best. But if you're at different angles or that ship is turning, single fire might benefit you, because if you go like bang, 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 then those shells are going to hit at different angles, which may benefit you, but might make it worse.
Yeah, there's some for lack of a better term, I say tactics, or should I say methodology, that you can begin to employ to manipulate what your guns are going to do. But for the most part, uh, what's a really helpful way if you want to kind of like track what your enemies are doing is fire one turret and then follow up with a full salvo of what's left, and use the first shot to basically check your lead, and then make an adjustment and fire the rest. So it's a good trick to help if you want to get like some immediate return on what your shells are doing, and kind of begin to do a little more figuring out about how the your gunplay is handling. A good place to practice this is either in co-op battles, because it's a very easy environment to check kind of where your shells are aiming and leading without putting yourself too through the paces with it, or really impacting anyone else's experience. And you can also do so in operations if there's a tier that lets you do that, which gives you some pretty decent rewards while you're also learning how those guns work too. So they're good places to try those things out and do some experimentation if you just don't want to sit in a training room all day.
Along with those same lines, I do something when I'm in a battleship or a cruiser and I'm firing at a DD. I'll actually single fire at the DD, so I'm putting 3 separate shots in 3 separate places versus double clicking on it when it's a DD. So I'm just putting them all in one spot.
Do we have any more questions for the group?
Going back to your first or second slide, we're talking about windage. As this game doesn't use, if you do have lock on targets, you don't use like range finding, right? The range is finite; it's set for you, and there's obviously no environmental controls in terms of your vehicle movement has no effect. The wind itself has no effect. What you are technically doing in terms of ballistics or firing a weapon of any sorts is called an ambush targeting. And and everyone knows this in the game, right? You're predicting where the target is going to go, but that is the technical term, is ambush points. You're figuring out the spot where the target is going and where it will be when your round is going to be there. You can use if you're using the upgraded information on the screen. It'll tell you the distance, the time of travel of your round of your shell. That'll help you in terms of determining how long it should be there. If you're using the dynamic or the static crosshairs, then the ticks on the sides will adjust from one to the next, or you can use the verticals or the lines and things like that can help you as well. But ultimately, it's the seconds you're trying to guess where the target's going to be in a finite amount of time, and that is your ambush point. So anything else that anyone else ever refers to as windage or holdover or anything like that is not applicable in this game. It's just simply ambush.
Yeah, the reason I brought it up is because there's a bunch of people on Reddit and the forums who sometimes use windage because they read a Wikipedia article and they think they know everything. So I was just I was pointing that out so that if people do hear those terms, they know that someone's referring to something in a point of ignorance, that it's not actual ballistics windage that we're talking about. Windage is aiming at a target and taking into account the speed of the wind and what direction it's coming from in relation to your shot, and making sure that it doesn't affect your shot.
Well, there's also the other factor is that you can fire a shot. Say if you're shooting at a target that's not moving, right, and you fire your first shot. If you're not locked on, your shells will go, basically towards the center of your crosshairs, right? And then you would essentially adjust your crosshairs towards the target based off of, relative towards center. That is the windage that you're applying to your aim. But because this game has lock on, essentially you do not have to make any sort of adjustments for your aim. The aim is always true. It always goes towards, well, we've talked about the lips, but it's always going towards the center of your crosshairs. So you don't need to make any adjustments like that. The only thing you're adjusting for is whether the target is moving or if they're not moving. And 9 times out of 10, most targets you're firing at in this game are going to be moving. And so at that point, you're trying to figure out where they're going to be when your shells land, as opposed to how do I make my my shells land where I'm aiming at, which would be windage.
Correct. Do we have any more questions from anyone about anything? I think I have one someone submitted to me in text here. Oh yeah, someone sent me a question about where you can find the slides or the video for this. So I'm going to be uploading this onto my YouTube channel. It's gonna have a little bit of an intro to it before it gets into this, but basically, you'll be able to find this and then share it with anyone. It encompasses a lot of different how it works videos, some correspondence, like I said, I had with Little White Mouse about asking her some questions, a bunch of article write-ups people have done over the years for the game, and cross-referenced a lot of stuff to make sure this is like the most updated, comprehensive guide on all of shell mechanics you could possibly have. So it will be made available. I'll put a link there so you can share it with your friends or keep it in your back pocket if you need it or whatnot. And I will make sure I update this as much as possible. Not like every 2 days, right? But when enough relevant changes happen, I'll make sure that this is updated so that people can use the video format to teach and learn off of in the future.